Greetings to everybody tonight. I pray that this evening finds you well and finds you prosperous. We're doing a community talk tonight, and it is a new program that our ministry is putting out. That's probably why it's a little late, because we want to make sure that everything is going correctly. This program for the community is called NewJC Now. And so we want to talk about things that affect the community, things that impact the community, so that we'll have a better understanding. No misnomers, no mysteries, no challenges there. We just want to make sure that when we bring people on, we're bringing people on so that we can be clear on subject matters and the things that really impact our community. And so for most of you that do know, and some of you that don't know, I'm Pastor Kevin Williams, and I pastor New Jerusalem Cathedral here in the city of Greensboro, as well as Mind in the Praise in High Point. And tonight we have one of our city officials, which is Mrs. Love Crossling Jones, and she is going to be sharing some things with us. So how are you tonight, Love?
I'm doing great, Pastor Williams. How are you doing?
Doing really, really good. Really, really good. Thank you for being on with us tonight, and definitely our first guest of NewJC Now. And so we want to talk about a few things, but before we do, would you tell everybody your job description, your job title, and your job description with the city of Greensboro?
Absolutely. So in my role for the city of Greensboro, I serve as the Human Rights Director. The Human Rights Department with the city of Greensboro is responsible for managing support for a few different populations in particular, but in general, examining the human rights needs of all populations that are marginalized in any sort of way. Specifically, we focus on fair housing, as well as the needs of justice served populations or those in search of a second chance by way of reentry. And then we also support international populations, and we do a significant portion of work supporting volunteer bodies like boards and commissions that are connected or tethered to the work of human rights, to include 5 bodies, actually: the Commission on the Status of Women, the Human Rights Commission, the International Advisory Committee, as well as a newly developed ad hoc committee for African American disparity, and also a transgender task force. All of these bodies are dedicated to ensuring that no one's health, safety, or rights in any way, shape, or form are compromised based on their identity. And so we do that work specifically with the volunteers from the community who serve on those boards and commissions, but we also cover those other previously mentioned areas. Again, we have 4 core areas that we work in, but it does not change the fact that we serve every portion of the population that finds themselves at the fray or at the margin where their rights have been violated in any way, shape, or form. And we take that information and what we learn from the community and look at policy, review, and change when necessary, as well as support the efforts of the city council, who's responsible most primarily for the implementation of policy for our city. And so that's the bulk of what we do. How this relates to why I was invited here tonight is that we know that COVID has impacted different populations uniquely by way of disparity. We know that Black and Brown populations have had the most severe cases statistically, as far as, the number of people per population ethnically who have been hospitalized and or experienced death as a result of COVID. We also know that some of the economic disparity that comes with COVID impacts minority populations in a very unique way. We've also been at the helm of conversations about the way in which international populations understand how to obtain resources and to be safe and healthy during this pandemic. And so from a number of angles, the Human Rights Department has been at the table with our city and our city's leadership in order to make sure that we have information distributed in a fair and equitable way, giving people the access to resources they need to remain safe.
There has been and that is quite a bit that your department does for our community. And definitely we thank you as well as all of our civil servants for all that they do, the things that we know about, and obviously things that we don't know about to keep our community safe. And so with that being said, there's a lot of misunderstandings about vaccine from a community perspective. And so these are the things that we want to address tonight. COVID impacts our community in a lot of different ways. And I want to know, how has COVID impacted our community economically? How it has impacted our community when it comes to our school, our education, as well as people as a whole? How has it impacted?
So much like what's happened in our national landscape, we have felt the hit of COVID significantly in Greensboro. From an economic perspective, what's been most complicated is that we had a lot of employment opportunities that were connected to recreation, and leisure. And so all of the jobs that were associated with the restaurant industry and or some sort of recreational industry, the hours were cut, the shifts were cut, and so a lot of people ended up unemployed. Another economic challenge that is a spin-off of that is when your employment is compromised. That usually means that your sheltering or your housing is compromised. And so we're grateful, of course, that the moratorium has been in place to prevent eviction and is extended through June 30th of this year. But what that means, of course, is that landlords who receive their livelihood from people occupying their dwellings that they own, they've had some challenges associated with their own income. And therefore, there's been a snowball effect at times of failure to repair, because what was used to repair the property is no longer coming in as an income. And so we've got people in compromised living conditions as well. Academically, of course, we know that our children have had to be extraordinarily resilient and transition to online learning. For those who have had the opportunity to get back to in-person learning, that has been complicated in and of itself by the fact that when cases are found in the schools, you have to go back to remote learning. So we've had some students who have been going back and forth in-person and remote learning for significant portions of the school year. Of course, all of Guilford County schools overall was practicing remote learning, especially middle school through high school up until very recently. But just the same, we've got students who have ultimately experienced what they call the learning slide. Or some learning regression. Usually what happens just in a short window over a summer where, no matter where kids are on the academic spectrum, they forget a little bit. Some students have been experiencing 365 days of that, all depending upon initial aptitude, as well as the learning resources that are available, internet access. So we've had a lot of challenges with the academic landscape for our students, as well as teachers who have been put in a very interesting space to learn on the drop of a dime how to teach with the same rigor and fervor and do that without being able to do so face to face. We've also had a lot of general community impact. Psychosocially, it's probably been the most complex. Our domestic violence cases in this city have hit an all-time high during the pandemic, mostly because of the fact that the stressors and tensions that come with marital and relationship dyad tensions just in general are exacerbated by everyone being stuck in the same place, having to deal with a lack of financial resources, children who are trying to figure it out academically, and then whatever pre-existing challenges there were in a relationship, now all of that is amplified. And so while there's never an excuse at all for domestic violence to take place, the reality of it has been intensified by way of this pandemic. Some other significant community challenges have had to do with mental health. While we know it's safest, and it has been demonstrated that it is safest for us to be much more remote, much less social. For some people, there has been an intensified challenge with mental health because of the inability to connect. It's one thing if you live in a household full of people like myself, where there's always, lots of energy and lots of love around. But for some people who live in isolation, COVID has been particularly grueling, and we've had an uptick in our national suicide rate as a result. On the other hand, you also have challenges associated with anxiety, particularly about, going out into the public and people really fearing doing much of anything for fear that they will be the ones who bear the responsibility of bringing the infection back to their homes, bringing the virus back to their four walls. And so how people have navigated has usually had a little backdrop of anxiety. And everyone knows that where there's anxiety, there's usually other stuff like frustration, depression, all of the other outpourings. And so our police department has been incredibly busy mitigating emergencies around domestic violence, but also mental health breaks. So there's a lot that has happened to compound just social existence as a result of the pandemic.
The stress that this has caused a lot of communities. And one thing I do realize about people, and that is that when people are under stress, there's also misunderstandings. And with those misunderstandings, if a person has a misunderstanding, they're sharing it with somebody else. Now we've got a community that has a lot of misunderstandings, which leads to my next question. And that is, what are some of the assumptions that you and the city has found that people have concerning the vaccine?
The assumptions run the gamut. Probably what we had to contend with early on was whether or not there were underlying or hidden agendas attached to the vaccine. So, of course, we know that our country's history rests on the backdrop of the horrific happenings to the Tuskegee Airmen. And as a result, knowing that at a certain point in our history, Black and brown bodies were used for experimentation more so than trying to preserve safety. Much of our Black and brown community had a lot of question about whether or not the vaccine was going to be ideal for us to consume in comparison to white populations. There was also concern from the international community about whether or not this would be a way to develop a record or track those who perhaps were undocumented, the name of deportation. There was also question about whether or not the vaccine from a medical lens was actually the virus being injected into your system versus the proteins. And so there have been a host of myths. There's also been question about whether or not the goal was to preserve the safety more so of more affluent populations socioeconomically, while creating greater disparity for those who were at or below the poverty line. And so the city of Greensboro has tried to take the approach of having small community conversations with specialized populations so that the Q&A can be very specific to the needs and concerns of that community. So out of our office, we actually hosted weekly conversations with the leaders of international communities, because there's a language barrier for some of the other outlets that the city was using. And we had the capacity as the language access coordinators of the city to offer some language support with our messaging. And so we did the due diligence of trying to dispel those myths about, whether or not Cone Health or any other entity would use those records more so for reporting those who are undocumented. And so we had representatives from Cone Health come in and have conversations about that. We've had physicians of color to sit on panels to talk about the efficacy, or for in lay terms, the extent to which the vaccine works across the board for all populations, and whether or not the side effects would be more intense for minorities as opposed to white populations. We have tried every way that we can to dispel, a lot of those myths. So what's come out of those conversations is that indeed the information is not used for deportation documentation. It is not the case that the vaccine was indeed developed with the intent of experimentation on minority populations more so than white populations. It is not the case that the vaccine for Pfizer and Moderna, it is not the case that the actual strain of the vaccine is being injected into your body, but it's protein recognition. And I'm not going to go into that in detail because people call me doctor, but that is not for medical reasons. And so I definitely don't want to mislead the community. But indeed, Pfizer and Moderna do not have the actual virus in the vaccine. And so no, people are not getting the vaccine when they get the virus. What's even more compelling are the myths about whether or not the extent to which you are safe after you consume or after you get the vaccine. And the city has had to do a lot of work to educate people about what it means after you get the vaccine. We've also had to do a lot of education about what it means if you don't get the vaccine. So if I could take the liberty, one example is that a lot of people are relying on other people to get vaccinated because they feel like if they can be surrounded by enough people who are vaccinated, then that means they won't get the vaccine. That they won't get the virus. And that's not true. If you opt out of getting the vaccine for any manner of reason, no one should judge you or call to question your personal decision. But it is important to be educated that being around people who have the vaccine does not mean you will not catch the virus, because people who have the vaccine can still be carriers of the virus. The vaccine is not necessarily indicative of you not having the viral load in your system. It's the way your body responds to the presence of the virus in your system, meaning that your body will not succumb to the most severe experience, where people are now hospitalized and dying. The idea is that the vaccine will mitigate that should you experience, it's just like the flu vaccine. You can get the flu vaccine, you can still get flu, but you don't feel the effects of flu, meaning that much like people who are walking around now with COVID and are asymptomatic, the vaccine makes you asymptomatic. And then the best that one can hope for, of course, is that because you are asymptomatic, then it is less likely that you would spread it to anybody else, and your body with the vaccine is already equipped to fight off the severity of the virus. That's what it's in essence designed to do. So that means that if you're a person who has not taken the vaccine and you are around a person who is vaccinated, but for some reason that person still is a carrier of the virus. You can still get the virus. Will there be a lesser likelihood? Ideally, because without symptoms, maybe one is not projecting, bodily fluids or anything like that, or vapors into the atmosphere. But as far as by way of technicality, can you still get the virus? You absolutely can. And so I've heard people say over and over again, well, I'm good because most of the people that I know have already gotten the shot, so I'm not going to worry about it. And that's really just not an accurate understanding of how this vaccine works. The other challenge is that some people assume that by getting the vaccine, that you don't necessarily need to be masked anymore or anything like that. And that's not altogether accurate either, because of the fact that you are still a carrier that could infect someone else.
So people should know in the community that if they've chosen to be vaccinated, they still, number one, can be a carrier. Number two, they still should wear a mask.
Absolutely. The reason for the mask mandate is not just as an additional safety precaution just for kicks and giggles. It really is that is one of the significant defenses against the spread of the virus. And even though we do have a higher vaccination rate in our community, it doesn't change the fact that in order to keep other people safe who have not taken the vaccine and may not have any intentions of getting the vaccine, that's why the mask mandate is so critical to follow. Also, people are at different phases of vaccination, and some people are assuming that by having started the process at all, that means that they have some enough of an immunity that they don't need to wear a mask. When the truth of the matter is, until you are completely vaccinated, you have not reached the maximum defense level against the virus, and you should certainly still be masked. Currently in our community, as far as the first dose, we've had 52,712 people get the vaccine. But as far as the second dose, only a fraction of that population has completed dose 2 at about 36,500. When you think about the fact that we live in a city of 290,000 people, that still is not a significant enough percentage of people for us to start navigating unmasked according to CDC guidelines.
Okay, so so the social experience that we are having now of the assumption that I'm vaccinated, and they're almost operating in a mindset of I'm invincible, but ultimately what they are is just asymptomatic.
In essence, and again, because I'm not the white coat wearer, I'm just a gray blazer wearer. Herd immunity is what has been the buzzword of the hour, that the more people who have it but are asymptomatic, eventually that'll make it very much like the way we navigate our community with knowing that flu is still alive and well, but we can go about, we can be unmasked, etc. Well, the thing is, until we achieve that version of herd immunity or what have you, we are still way more vulnerable to this virus. And so the other critical issue that doesn't require me to wear a white coat to speak to is the fact that we only know the short-term efficacy or the short-term effects of the virus, of the vaccine up to this point. There's still questions about when it wears off. Some people are saying that, it's some medical professionals are saying that you have one amount of time until you have to get a booster, so to speak. Some medical professionals are suggesting otherwise. And the thing is, we really don't know. The vaccine has really only been available since the top of the year. So the other part is the gamble of learning the hard way that it wears off sooner than anticipated for some, We don't know what the genetic uniqueness of responses to the vaccines. For some people, it may last as long as it's supposed to. For other people, it may happen at a shorter term. And what we don't want as a community is to learn that the hard way overwhelmingly, because we're navigating without using basic precautions that could keep us safe.
Okay, so would you explain, because I want to make sure that I am intentional about certain questions, would you explain why the city then still has the mask mandate?
Sure. The purpose of the mask mandate and the reason why the city upholds it is for two reasons. First, our city operates in reflection of the county's response to the state. And the state guideline is still that the mask mandate is in place. And so from a governmental perspective, it's partly because we are a reflection of our state's government, and therefore we learn and get guidance from our from our state level of government that then influences the choices that we make locally. Aside from just a structural response by way of government, the reason by way of just health and safety is that when you have a population that is only not even a third fully vaccinated, you cannot run the risk of people navigating and congregating in different size crowds who may have different levels of vulnerability to the vaccine. And so, different levels of vulnerability to the virus, and perhaps have not been vaccinated. You cannot run the risk. It's not responsible on behalf of our city's leadership to lift that mask mandate, knowing the number of people who have to go back to work, have to go back to school, have to go back to certain activities, and make them more vulnerable than they were at the top of the pandemic.
Our state, because you mentioned about our community is responding to the mandate of the state, and so that the whole state is creating the law, structure, rules for counties, for cities, all of that. Then there are levels. There are levels of what we can and cannot do. Can you explain what level we are at?
Sure. What was outlined at the top of the pandemic was 4 phases or 4 levels that we would operate in as far as how we navigate and congregate in our communities. We're currently in phase 3 or level 3. And that allows for more navigation and more freedoms than we've had in times past. But the spectrum is based on the level of infection rate and the level of infection rate as it relates to the availability of the vaccine. So we were in phase 1 where we couldn't go anywhere hardly, and we had curfews, and schools were closed down completely because the infection rate was continuing to increase on a regular basis, and we had no vaccine development, or at least we didn't have any vaccine distribution. So there was no way to combat the virus, and the infection rate was was continuing to increase. And we stayed at that space of phase 2, between phase 1 and 2, because the infection rate was just continuing on an incline. The reason we're at phase 3 is because of the fact that we have developed a vaccine that is accessible and has been distributed to or made available first to our most vulnerable population, of course, to include healthcare professionals, certain critical employees, and of course, our senior population. And we're continuing to see the availability of the vaccine increase. That's also combined with the fact that our hospitalizations and our infection rate has started to level off. It does not mean that it is on the level of decline that would be desired, but it has started to level off. So the reason that we hit these phases, as outlined by our governor, is based on the availability of the vaccine and what is seen as far as trends in the infection rate. An example of that is that right now, Guilford County is at about a 7.6% positive infection rate on a daily basis. If you compare that to the holidays around Christmas and New Year's, where after those two holidays, because people still insisted on traveling in many instances and gathering in many instances, we actually hit an infection rate peak of about 12.5%. And so now we're at 7.6%. The vaccine is available, and so it is considered by CDC guidelines and by our state mandate that phase 3 is a suitable hovering place. But rest assured, whether or not we move into another phase where we have more access to gathering, where we can increase the number of people allowed in enclosed spaces, et cetera, is going to be based on the trend of that infection rate combined with the rate at which people are getting vaccinated.
Okay, so with that being said, because there's a number of recreation places that are not open at 100%, and there's some that are not open at all, like movie theaters, things like that. With that being said, can you explain to me what is the city's position concerning those places that are somewhat open, not open at 100% versus not open at all?
So the whole perspective from the city standpoint is to make sure people are safe and able to navigate in order to fulfill their their necessities and to meet their necessities. That does not mean that recreation is not valued in any way. And as a result, we do have some slow and soft openings of different kinds. But the whole point in doing it very slowly and methodically is so that people can do the things they need to do, like go to work, go to school, shop for food, things like that, with a certain level of safety in mind and intact. As things open, as things open up, there's still a necessary precaution from the perspective of our community's leadership, because you still have to, at the end of the day, account for or mitigate an increase in infection rates. We have to make sure that that doesn't happen as you continue to open things up. And so that's why it's been so vital for establishments to follow the guidelines. And even those establishments that have liberty, like, for example, churches, because of the separation of church and state, as you know, Pastor Williams, after a lawsuit, all of the churches were free to operate as they did before the pandemic. But there is a gratitude from a health and safety perspective for those churches that have operated in a skeletal fashion without opening to the public, because that would have been, as we learned from other states and other communities that were not under these kinds of mandates, that those places become a hot spot. Churches, especially across the country, were hot spots for increases and surges in infection rates. And so even those places that are not under the guidelines to not open, the idea of opening very slowly, very methodically, and meeting the needs without going into, a full-blown operation is critical right now for all of the reasons that I've mentioned. And that's the case with every business. That's the case with every faith community, not just churches, but our mosques, masjids, et cetera. Like, it's important for there to be a mindfulness about what are the implications if my doors open too quickly and I don't put the proper mandates and measures in place, because we could end up back at square one, especially with, like I said, right now, we've only got 36,504 people fully vaccinated out of 290, almost 300,000 people. And so, when you've only got that few number of people vaccinated, and then you open everything up full throttle, you end up running the risk of really ending up back at square one.
The why do you feel people are so eager to get back to what is considered normal, and what were you to get back to?
First and foremost, the reason why people are eager to get back to normal should be looked at through a lens of compassion first. I know that people who are very cautious, can tend to get frustrated with those who are the eager beavers, but part of it is back to what I said about mental health. The reality is that some people have been able to cope with mental health and distress because of the fact that they surround themselves with people. Some people feed off of other people. And so in the isolation that has come with this pandemic, sometimes people have been forced to digest the idea of wherever you go, there you are. And there is a discomfort of that comes with that kind of isolation. And so some people literally, in the name of preserving their mental health on some level, are very desperate to get back to some level of connectivity. For other people, where the interest is really not connectivity, it is about the relieving of anxiety. Whenever we can do things in a rote kind of mechanistic way that's like operating much like a machine, we tend to relax. And so our anxiety levels are not as intense if we can feel some sense of routine. And when people think about the way that they've had to modify their lives, wipe down their grocery, all of these other things that, people normally have not had to do, not hug people they love for a year, the yearning is to get back to a rhythm, something that feels like what they used to know, so that anxiety levels can come down. Then there's also the economic influence. Our country is an economic engine. Greensboro is no different. We have a lot of business owners who are desperate to have patronage so that they don't have to go under. The number of restaurants, bars, all kinds of establishments, travel agencies, etc., that had to shut down and pretty much close their doors. People are desperate to get back to some sort of run-of-the-mill version of economic flow. And then finally, and probably what's most intense, is that people have a desire to, people long for what they know. People are nostalgic. So you'll hear people talk about the good old days in almost any conversation. Well, now it just so happens that the good old days was only about 365 days ago and some change. And sometimes people just long for what they used to know. The reality is that in many ways, we will not go back to what we used to know, because there is not enough evidence that what we're doing right now is working to go back to everything we were doing before March of 2020. So for example, the way that you navigate when you travel, the way in which you congregate and connect to people, even in social experiences like, let's say, your galas and balls and things, so grandiose things that people sometimes like to attend and participate in, get all dressed to the nines, etc. The way that we do all of that, because there's not enough information about whether or not these precautions are going to work long term, whether or not the how long or to what extent the effectiveness of the vaccine may be, we're not going to see what we knew before March 2020 for some time, if ever. Now, that sounds really doom and gloom, doesn't it? Well, the truth of the matter is that there are also some really good things that have come out of what we've learned about how our community can function, the things people can have access to by way of using electronic platforms like Zoom, etc., instead of having to always be face to face. And so this has given us a technological push that bring some things closer to our fingertips, and it's not as exacerbating or as labor intensive to access certain things. And so in that regard, I doubt that people who do have access to those resources would want to go 100% back to what we knew in before March of 2020. Some people have worked remotely for an extensive period of time and have learned that there is the ability to capture all of their work responsibilities without always being in a separate four walls by way of brick and mortar. So there's a lot that has changed. Some of it we've learned a lot and it's positive. Some things that we miss, we're going to continue to miss for a while.
What are some of the dangers of trying to get back to this thing called normal?
Well, the dangers are two-part. The first is the actual impact on one's physical well-being, right? The fact that if we haven't gotten enough people vaccinated, and that says nothing against those who opt out of it, but just for whatever number of people desire to be vaccinated, if they're not at the place where they've made it onto the list, then trying to go back to normal makes those people who would desire to be vaccinated, it puts them in a position to be forced to operate and navigate without that layer of protection. The other thing, so as far as health and safety, more people are vulnerable and susceptible to the infection. But the other challenge is economic, actually. If we are too eager to get back to normal, then the very places that are slowly opening up will shut down twice as quickly in the name of health and safety. And it won't be up to the owner of that establishment, but it will be by federal or state mandate. If these infection rates hit an uptick and peak out again, like they did in times past, then we're subject to go back to what we were already operating in, which is more business establishments being closed, fewer recreational opportunities. And of course, if you talk about health and safety and then you talk about economics, then naturally you also have to talk about psychosocial, which means that we're going to be right back at square one with the level of psychological distress around financial challenges and job loss. We're also going to be at the space where our children are forced to try to learn remotely because schools may very well shut down again. We'll also be forced to have to navigate health and safety challenges for our loved ones. I know that I had family members who were hospitalized during the pandemic, and that is a whole different beast when we're at those different phases of protections, like those earlier phases, trying to just get to your loved ones in hospitals and under healthcare. Like, we're gonna revisit a whole lot of March 2020. And so for as eager as people are to get back to some version of normalcy, what's really important to understand is that if we move too swiftly, we will be in a situation where we will be back at March 2020 again, and really trying to figure out how to get back just like we are now. And so I don't know if getting back to normal is really the mantra that we should be rehearsing in our hearts and minds, so much as it's more about what is it that we have to look forward to? What do we look forward to as we navigate through this pandemic? And back to normal might not need to be a target.
Our church know that there are a lot of larger congregations that have, even though we have, quote unquote, the civil liberty to be able to reopen, we have opted to have a community mindset to make sure that our community is safe. Mm-hmm. With that being said, I think that it would be important to know what is the city's plan? Does the city have a plan? And because I know that, of course, the city's plan will be connected to the state plan, but from learning from, and I want to be very careful in how I say this, but I also understand that our state is learning also from some of the mistakes of other states, mm-hmm. so don't fall into that direction. And so, because I do know that there are some other states that are, their numbers are going up, and our state has learned a great deal from some of those errors. And so what is the plan that our city/state, what is our plan going forward that the community should be aware of?
Well, it's interesting that you should ask that, because the answer that I have might not sound very, I guess, sophisticated in nature, but that is because you use the word learner and learning, and that is what we're doing as a community all of the time. The one thing that can certainly be appreciated about our city's leadership, whether it's the city council or city management, is that they are allowing the trends to tell the story and look at the relationship to the state model and how those trends tell the story for the state. And so what's really important, probably a better way to educate the community about a plan, is how to access the updates to the plan. And that is by way of the city website, because things are subject to change. There are times that Greensboro has taken a deeper dive and put in more restrictions than were initially implemented at the state level, but it was butted right up against, the state was like a couple of days behind the city in its decision. But the city is very committed to being proactive, to being preventive. And being preventive is hard, because being preventive means that you have to make decisions based on information and then determine what that information means as far as what could happen, and yet still be very cognizant of what is happening. And so because of that, the city has not made any major declarations or major proclamations about we're going to open up full throttle at this point, because the city remains sensitive to the way in which the trends impact the outcomes for health and safety. So people might say, well, okay, a 7% infection rate, we kind of know what that means. That means 7% of the city's population at any given time might be infected. That's still not a huge number. So why would there be that much caution about an infection rate? Well, the other relationship as far as statistics to that is the hospitalization rate. Whenever the infection rate goes up, there's also an uptick in hospitalization historically. The challenge is that we only have a certain number of beds, which means that when we hit those spike peak places, like any city in America, we run the risk of having to turn away people who need to be hospitalized, because there aren't enough beds to accommodate them. And so you never want to be in that position. That is where New York found itself. And that's what created some of the horrific outcomes in our larger cities. And so Greensboro, much like any other municipality in the state or country, is trying to be preventive. So the best thing that one can do is to connect yourself to the city website information consistently, seeking it out, pulling it up. There are COVID links on the main page that give updates, not only about the trends for infection rates and hospitalizations, et cetera, but there are also updates about the rate at which city services are reopening and the rate at which one can utilize recreation spaces, et cetera. So it's all about making a commitment to remain informed. Many times people want a snapshot answer that sets the stage for what they will do, but most people don't want to be that hypersensitive and have to check on a regular basis to get updates. But the reality is that this pandemic is not allowing us to do it much differently, because at the end of the day, because things are subject to change, especially when you have hotspot situations. So if you have gatherings that where people are not following mandates, and then there's an outbreak, that outbreak creates a ripple effect for the city's numbers almost every time. That's the whole point of the CDC asking each state and each municipality to follow outbreaks, because when 15 people in one place, even if they're with 100 people, if 15 out of 100 people are positive, the number of people who go home positive is always amplified, which means then those households are impacted. And so what the city is trying to do is mitigate the likelihood that we will have hotspots and outbreaks.
So then what is when we hear the word spike, hotspots and spike, what does that really?
What that means is that you have a cluster of people percentage-wise, a statistical significance percentage-wise of people in one place at one time who were positive, who then increase the likelihood that other people who are in the same place at the same time are also carriers. So a hotspot is just that, what I just described, that place where a significant percentage of people had it. They did not typically follow guidelines, and therefore it created a rapid spread. A spike refers to the statistical rate of infection for the whole city. So there's a hot spot, could be 15 people, could be 20 people, and then you look up and 55 people have it because they were in close proximity and they were not following guidelines. Then what that does is it influences the infection rate percentage for the city. Once all of those active cases are reported, you may find that if you have enough of those hot spots at one time, that it creates a spike in the overall number of people who have reported positive for the virus. So spikes are usually the result of unlawful gatherings these days, or lawful gatherings where people did not follow all of the precautions. So I'll give an example. A hotspot can be a group of people who rent out a huge cabin, because that's like that was a popular trend back in the winter, and it is every year. 20 some odd friends rent out huge cabin, and everybody wants to have a weekend getaway at the mountains. Well, 3 of the people there came in positive, and 12 of the people, when they leave, are positive and go back to separate households and infect everyone. So that cabin trip is a hot spot. On another scale, a hot spot can be like a club or a church gathering. We have heard of hot spots coming from both spaces. You've got a mass gathering of people who, in the case of a church, it was actually lawful to be gathered, but they did not follow all of the mandated procedures. There was no social distancing, because even if you can have 4,000 people in a building, it doesn't change the fact that the CDC says that they need to be 6 feet apart. And so in a situation like that, you can create another hotspot in that way.
Okay. All right. So, well, so the best thing according to the city, because what I want to do is I want to step away from even though I'm a pastor and I pastor a church, I want to step away from the church aspect of, because we have the liberty to do it, because the liberty to do it, for me, my perspective is, just because I have the liberty to do it doesn't mean that it is the wisest thing to do. Or because I have the liberty to do it doesn't mean that it is the smartest thing to do. All right. So taking that liberty away, because that liberty is more legal than anything else. All right. Take that liberty away. What is the wisest way to approach then gatherings? What is the city perspective, CDC perspective at this point for a gathering? Because what I'm experiencing right now, as I watch our community, there are people that are trying to force this new normal and say it's okay. All right. Mm-hmm. So what is the perspective of the city? What is the perspective of, I would say, our state or CDC that would be considered the wisest approach when it comes to gatherings, if at all? I think that's the best way for me to pose this question.
So one of the things that's really critical to think about when you're talking about households of faith is that, barring the legal constraints, there are still CDC guidelines in place about what is safest. And so even at the state level, the ability to assemble indoors and the ability to assemble outside, those numbers still would have to be taken into consideration if you were looking solely at CDC guidelines. So, for example, a church that has maybe normally 500 people, even if you had the ability legally to assemble, could you put 500 people in your faith, in your household of faith, socially distanced? And if you cannot, then you still have to, in wisdom, determine, is this a safe environment for worship? If you have the ability to make people social, to put people in socially distance, do you have the mechanisms in place to ensure that the mask mandate is upheld? And so when you look at that, it creates a totally different algorithm for churches than what people think as far as just the civil liberty aspect of it. Now, I have no qualms. I don't have any judgments about any household of faith that's in full operation at any size. That is the personal choice of that household of faith's leadership, and legally they have the permissions. But if you are looking at how do I assemble this group with the safety measures that have been recommended and mandated by the state, then that's when some churches ideally may not be able to reopen. Smaller congregations, very small congregations that are having services outside, or very small congregations, like some churches literally have 15 people and they're in a building that is room for 100 people. You literally have the ability to space people out 6 feet apart. And with only 15 people inside, perhaps there is the ability to watch every person and cross every T and dot every I as far as mask mandates. Are people washing their hands and sanitizing on the way in and out the door as every person touches that door on the way in and out? Because it's only 15 hands, right? Well, 30, because people have 2 hands, but you get what I'm saying. However, when you're talking about your larger church, in wisdom, you have to consider, can people be as safe as they need to be in this establishment at full capacity? And the short answer is that in most instances, no. Which means that you would then have to develop an algorithm for who could come in when and under what circumstances. So like the average large church, if they were going to try to keep everybody the right number of feet apart, when you do that math, it's a matter of taking these cohorts in, and you have to decide who gets to go first and who gets to come back on Wednesday versus who can't come until Wednesday after next for Bible study, but not Sunday morning service, because you still got to keep the right capacity. And so when you look at that, for very large churches, it is wisest, based on CDC guidelines, to open very slowly and very methodically, and to do so with an understanding of what is still considered a safety mandate in any other space. Because a lot of times the general public, because of how they feel about their faith communities and the sanctity of those faith communities, they might say, well, by faith, I'm going to risk it. And that's a choice. But what has to be taken into consideration is, as a leader of a household of faith, if a grocery store still says that a certain percentage of capacity is only permissible, and if a convenience store says that only this number of people can be inside, and if a dentist office says that only this number of people can be inside and they still have to be this number of feet apart, then you have to really think about, how is my household of faith reflecting what keeps people safe in every other place that they navigate? So the mandates, the mandates from the state as far as gatherings have increased. They have increased, I believe, to up to 100 outside and up to 50 indoors. And I'm going to double check that as we're continuing to have the conversation. But I do believe that it is, it's increased by 100% of what was mandated in the earlier phases. But that still is not full capacity by a long shot. And so when you think about the number of micro weddings that have taken place over the year, and other things in the name of still trying to maintain that social distancing and make sure that you have enough crowd supervision to ensure that everyone is wearing their mask properly, because as a chin strap or as a forehead strap, that's not wearing the mask properly. When you think about equipping one's ushers, and now we got some show enough, ushers in different churches who will make sure that you wear that mask right where it's supposed to be. But when you think about just the sheer number of people that are permissible inside households of faith right now, if all of the larger ones met capacity, then ensuring that people have on their masks and ensuring that people are sanitized, coming in and out of doors, and ensuring that when praise and worship sings, that it's the proper number of feet away from the front row to ensure that there's not projection unless people are singing with masks on, and some people don't have the capacity to do that. All of these are nuances that a responsible gathering, regardless of what kind of gathering it is, takes into consideration. So any responsible gathering, whether it's a household of faith or a group of people, 10 people at a family reunion, the reality is that what you have to do to ensure safety has to be able to be managed. And that's the question that every faith leader that has permission to assemble in mass gathering has to ask themselves. Can I ensure the same safety that's mandated everywhere else? And if one cannot, then that's why it's cause for a slower and more methodical plan for reopening.
I'm going to close out, but I want to piggyback on that, because when people see a group of 20 or 50 people that are out there, and I'm going to throw in the fact that I know that you were talking about grocery stores and dental offices and things like that, but I don't. I know that in a dental office and a grocery store, you're not going to catch the spirit and move and shift and things like that. And so church, and because churches are so different, sometimes people that are part of larger churches will look at smaller congregations, and if they can do it, then why aren't we doing it? Would you give us an understanding about what would be the difference, I guess, between the 15-member, 20-member, 30-member congregation that can effectively stay apart? And I've seen some of them. I've seen some videos, and I don't think that they did too well. Even the smaller ones did too well staying apart when the presence of God came. And when the presence of God came, then of course it is the mindset, you can't control the spirit. So how do we respond to people that are watching those situations and still try to explain that from a community point of view? Because for me, this is really about community. Watching the fact that there are other cities in other states that are not at 7%, at 15%, some are at 20%, some are at 25%. And they're not considering the fact that it is their actions that are contributing to the higher numbers that are spiking in those areas.
Mm. So the critical thing to understand about when you see a gathering from a distance is that there are always unique details to each gathering. And so when you're talking about faith communities, you're exactly right. If it is a very small congregation and they have the ability to spread out or have service outdoors, et cetera, then you've got a lower chance of infection rate, even if someone were to make a mistake and not have their mask in proper position or what have you. It's going to be a lower chance of infection. But when you're talking about charismatic worshipers, those who do believe in, spiritual dance, speaking in tongues, those kinds of things, and in charismatic worship, there being an understanding that I move the way that God allows me to move freely, then the same way that ushers come around to help people when they're losing their garments of clothing and everything else, a mask is also a garment. How close is the usher supposed to get in order to make sure someone's mask is where it's supposed to be? If a person takes off running around people that they don't know, and their mask flies off, what are the implications of that? There's absolutely nothing that I've heard any faith leader want to do to prohibit charismatic worship if that is the foundation of the culture of their faith community. But you also have to think wisely about what are the implications of that, for a household of faith full of charismatic worshipers at full capacity on any given Sunday or any given day of the week. What will be the mechanisms of control in order to mitigate those outlier factors like masks flying off, or people being out in the spirit? And, is the usher supposed to just kind of stand from way far away and, say, bless them, Jesus, and hope, that they, have all of the resources that they need? Like those are the kinds of things that if you can't full throttle answer those questions with effective responses that will ensure safety, like that's the kind of stuff that faith leaders need to be kind of in the lab figuring out right now, so that there can be the effective responses. And I think the other thing to also consider is that when people assemble and they know those among them, that's one thing. So you might see 20 people assembled, and those 20 people may know that out of the 20, only 3 people haven't been haven't had the vaccine yet. And so there's a way to say we understand the risk measure of us all being in the same place at the same time. But when you're talking about hundreds upon hundreds, perhaps thousands of people being in the same place at the same time, you really can't account for who may or may not have been vaccinated in the same way. And then for those who are a little more conscientious and they say, well, excuse me, usher, I would like to be in the vaccinated section of the church. What is that? And where is that? Where is that? So again, I say these things with a little bit of humor, but I do want to reiterate that there is no judgment for the way that people choose to assemble, but it's just about those precautions and the extent to which one's team amongst faith leadership have sat down at the drawing board to really think of how to offset some of those hazards that could come from assembling without those proper measures being in place.
One last thing that we have not discussed, and I want to say thank you for coming on, because a lot of these questions needed to be answered from the perspective of city leadership and what the city of Greensboro's perspective is concerning where we are right now in this phase. The last part of it is a little smaller. And what I mean by a little smaller is that the focus has been how many people have been vaccinated versus how many people have not been vaccinated. But also, one of the things that is not really talked about that much is that whether they are vaccinated or not, how does that impact? So let's say the vaccinated people say, well, I'm good and everything is good and I can be maskless. And of course, we've learned that you cannot be maskless. But what happens to our little people?
So there are a couple of things to consider with younger populations. I'm the bonus mom of a child who is under the age of 16. And so even in the way that our household navigates, the one thing we're always conscientious of is the fact that we have a person in our household who actually cannot be vaccinated. And that's really important to think about because of the fact that right now the CDC, even though they're doing some trials and there's been some volunteerism for children under the age of 16 to get the vaccine, we don't have any clearance as of yet for children under the age of 16. And so we still have to model behaviors that they will follow for their own safety. Now, what have we at least understood by way of popular media and medical experts? That children overall are not experiencing the intensity of the virus like some middle-aged adults and older. But what we've also learned is that whether or not a small child or a child under the age of 16 will experience the most severe version of COVID is unpredictable. Meaning that we have had children who have passed away from COVID. We have had children who have been violently ill. But to this point, no one's been able to pinpoint exactly the conditions under which a child will experience the most severe version of the illness. Several articles have come out to say, well, this child passed away with no pre-existing conditions. Well, usually, even if there is a such thing as a pre-existing condition, you don't know you have it always until your body is exposed to something that intensifies and exposes it. So assuming that our children are perfectly fine with no pre-existing conditions overwhelmingly may be accurate. But there are some parents that are really hurting right now because they too thought their children had no pre-existing conditions and that their children weren't in any danger whatsoever, and modeled, social experiences and allowed children to be exposed based on the understanding that they were safe. And what we're learning is that overwhelmingly children may be safe, but finding out the hard way that they're not is a gamble that many parents are not willing to sign up for. So what does that mean by way of modeled behavior? If you are an adult who demonstrates and even asserts that a mask is not essential, especially because you've been vaccinated, but you have a small child or even a risky teen who is watching you navigate without a mask, or watching you assemble in places where everyone is not a part of the same household and you're not masking or not maintaining 6 feet, et cetera, then what it creates is this false perception of safety for younger populations. And especially with teenage population, that's so critical because teens have the ability to navigate without full parental supervision if they're of driving age. And so if you've got a young person who is 15 going on 16, excited about the chance to drive, but is not vaccinated yet, and perhaps in your household, there's no intention for anyone that young to get the vaccine, then you have to be sure to model behaviors that when they're out of your presence, they will still maintain those levels of caution. The other complicated thing that has not been mentioned in our conversation, Pastor Williams, is people who have gotten it and survived it. And I think that is probably equally noteworthy when it comes to talking to young populations. A host of people have said, I'm a COVID survivor, hashtag COVID survivor, all of these things that certainly make people feel a certain assurance about, can I beat it if I get it? And part of the challenge with that is that, yes, overwhelmingly, there will be many populations that contract COVID. They will sit out their 2 weeks at home and they will survive it. But we still don't have a whole lot of predictors as to who will and who won't. And so you don't want young people to get in their psyche, it's okay if I catch it because I'll probably survive it. And it'd be the instance that that young person ends up in the hospital or something of that sort. So model behavior is critical because it teaches young people how to engage in agency when they're not in the presence of those who normally supervise them. And so doing the things that are suggested as safety guidelines is really important if you want your child to be safe when they're not with you.
Again, I want to thank you for being our first guest on NewJC Now. This has really been informative. You represent our city, and we love our city, and we want all of the people in our community safe. Would you let people know where they can get information on the city websites, things like that, so that if they need updates that the city is providing, that they'll be able to get those updates and be a bit more informed?
Absolutely. So if you go to the city standard website, which is www.greensboro-nc.gov, and I'll say that a little bit slower for anyone who's writing, www.greensboro-nc.gov. On the general website, you will find links for information. There are several spotlights on the page for different information related to COVID. Currently, there is a placeholder to the left, if you scroll down on the screen, that is a link to general COVID information. And you can click there and it will take you through a myriad of resources. You can also go to our you can also search our site, the human rights site for the city of Greensboro. The easiest way to navigate that is to go to the city webpage and then type in human rights. On our human rights page, we also have a link for COVID information that focuses a little more on disparities, whether it's food insecurity or access to information for how to connect to sites for vaccines, et cetera. All of that information, there are placeholders on both of those pages. And if you're not a person who's savvy when it comes to, this tech world that we live in, you can simply call 336-373-2038. And that is the number to the Human Rights Office. And we will do our very best to connect you to whatever resources are necessary for you to get the support that you need.
Would you give that telephone number?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Would you give that telephone number one more time?
Absolutely. 336-373-2038. And that is the number for the Human Rights Department for the city of Greensboro.
Excellent, excellent. Again, thank you. And this has been the first episode of NewJC Now. And I'm your host, Pastor Kevin Williams, and want to make sure that our community is safe, our community is informed, and that we operate in a spirit of excellence and brotherly love for our community. Again, thank you all for watching tonight, and thank you for sharing this program tonight, because as many people as get the information, then we have the right information that is being circulated around our community. Thank you so much again, and God bless you all. Have a good night. Thank you.